Prague off the beaten track. Vít Pohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.
Hello and welcome to Prague off the beaten track. Today I'm taking you to a place that I think, if not most, then many people in Prague know extremely well, and yet very often don't really see. It's right in the city center, surrounded by busy streets, shops and offices, a place many of us pass through on autopilot. And that's exactly why it belongs in this series. It's not hidden behind walls or gates, it's not somewhere you need a map to find. It's hiding in plain sight, woven so tightly into everyday life of this city that I think we tend to forget just how much history it holds. This is a place shaped by almost 2 centuries of arrivals and departures, of first journeys and last goodbyes, of people heading out into the world and coming back home. It's a place where history isn't locked away in glass cases, but still very much alive. Maybe we will hear occasional announcement echoing through the hall. The sound of trains arriving and leaving is probably not heard because they are too far, but there might be some footsteps on the platforms, or rather people going to the platforms. And while all of that is happening, this place is also quietly changing, adapting to a new Prague growing up around it. So, in this episode, we'll slow down for a moment and take a closer look at why this place still matters, what stories it carries, and why I'm sure that it deserves more than just a hurried glance on the way to the next train. To understand why Masarykovo nádraží, and now I reveal where I'm standing, exists where it does, and why Prague was among the first cities in this part of Europe to truly get a steam railway, we have to reach back a little further. In the first half of the 19th century, railways were still a brand new idea, and the Austrian Empire, of which Prague was then part, of course, was just beginning to connect its biggest cities with iron rails and steam engines. The very first steam railways in this region were laid out from Vienna northwards, linking the imperial capital first with the Moravian towns like Břeclav, then Brno, Olomouc and beyond, creating a kind of backbone of what would later become the Czech railway network. Without that early push to build rail connections across the empire, there would have been no reason and no tracks for trains to reach Prague at all, of course. And it was against that backdrop of new rail ambition that Masaryčka was born. By the early 1840s, engineers and city planners had decided that the open fields just outside Prague's fortification walls, at the end of what we now call Hybernská Street, were the ideal place for a link to this emerging railway web. The location was chosen because the land was relatively free of buildings, and because from here the line could be extended in several directions across Bohemia and beyond, as I will mention in a minute. It was designed by the engineer Jan Perner and built under the supervision of architect Antonín Jüngling. And the station was ready in 1845, at a moment when steam railways were still very much something new and modern in Europe. The first regular trains began serving Prague here on the 1st of September 1845, making this not just one of the city's oldest transport hubs, but also a symbol of Prague's early connection to the wider industrial advances of its time. Now, it's worth saying this, I suppose, straight away. Prague wasn't the very first city in Europe to get a steam railway, of course, but it certainly wasn't late either. When the first trains arrived here in 1845, cities like London, Paris, Vienna or Berlin had already seen steam engines for a few years. But we're talking about a difference of less than a decade, not a whole generation. And in mid-19th century terms, that meant Prague was still very much part of the first wave of railway cities, joining a new technology that was only just beginning to reshape Europe. In fact, if you look east and south from here, Prague was ahead of many other places. Budapest, for example, would see its first steam railway a year later. And what really matters is this: Prague didn't get its railway as a local curiosity, of course, but as a part of a much bigger kind of imperial project. The Austrian Empire was stitching itself together with rails, starting from Vienna and pushing north and east through Brno and Olomouc, as I mentioned, and eventually all the way to Prague. So this station was born out of that ambition, and from the very beginning it connected Prague not just to nearby towns but to the wider European world. And once the railway reached Prague, things moved quite quickly. From here, tracks soon pushed north through Bohemia, linking the city with the industrial regions of what we now call northern Bohemia, and then on across the border into Saxony in Germany. By the early 1850s, trains from this very station could take passengers to Dresden, and from there further on to Berlin and other German cities. Suddenly, I think Prague was no longer just a destination at the edge of an empire, but a stop on an international railway map, connected by steam and steel to the heart of Europe. It's also important, I think, to remember just how special railway travel was in those early days. And in the mid-19th century, taking a train certainly wasn't a routine. It was an event. Railway companies gradually started investing heavily not just in technology but in the whole atmosphere around rail travel, in polished wood, ironwork, glass symmetry and decoration. Especially the first class carriages for the wealthier passengers were designed to impress. I think that sense of dignity and order extended naturally to the stations themselves, and here at Masaryčka, as it is kind of less formally known, to the stations themselves. And that's definitely something you can still feel and see here at Masarykovo, nádraží, or Masaryčka, as it is less formally known today. Despite all the changes, it has gone through extensions, rebuilds, wartime damage, modernization, and careful restoration. The station has held on to a certain imperial elegance. At least I can still see it here. The iron columns, the proportions of the halls, the way light kind of filters through the glass roof, all echo a time when travel was meant to feel grand and meaningful. Even in the 21st century, and that means now, Masaryčka still carries that quiet confidence of a place that was built not just to function, but to represent something larger than everyday life. On a more personal note, I should probably add that for a while when I was living in Prague, actually for several years, I used Masaryčka or Masarykovo nádraží almost every day, commuting from here to my suburban flat. And I remember very well that still around 2013, 2014, the station, especially this part of it, was not in great shape, by no means. There were odd little shops that didn't quite belong together. The atmosphere felt tired. The space that had once been a first-class dining room had actually turned into what we call a herna, a small gambling place, a kind of mini-casino, where all sorts of people would take refuge. Next to it there was a cheap and very modest Vietnamese restaurant, and the whole area felt more like a homeless shelter than, in some places like a homeless shelter, definitely, than a place that you would want to spend time in. And what makes the contrast so striking today is how carefully and thoughtfully this has all changed in the past few years. The restaurant has since been beautifully renovated with a clear respect for the building's history and original character. This wasn't just a cosmetic makeover. Art historians and heritage specialists, as I read, were involved, and it shows. What was once a neglected corner is now a proper first-class restaurant again, elegant without being stiff and completely at ease with its surrounding. It's, I think, a reminder that places like this don't need to be reinvented. Sometimes they just need to be understood and given the care they deserve. And in fact, this is exactly where the idea for this episode came from, because Radio Prague International team held its Christmas party here a few weeks back, right in this restaurant. and we had a whole section of the space for ourselves. There's excellent Pilsner beer, Pilsner Urquell. There's very good cuisine. And sitting here, away from the rush of the platforms, I suddenly realized just how good this place really is. Not just, I think, the setting, but the service, the atmosphere, the confidence with which it works. It struck me that this isn't just a railway restaurant at all. It's actually a destination in its own right, a place worth coming to simply because you want to, even if you don't have a train to catch. And I think this applies to the whole Masarykovo nádraží, to the whole of Masaryčka. It is exactly what Prague off the beaten track is about. It's not hidden, it's not remote, and it's not forgotten, and yet it's a place we often overlook simply because it's woven so tightly into everyday life. Masaryčka, in my opinion, reminds us that some of Prague's most interesting stories aren't waiting at the end of a long journey. They are right here under our noses if we are willing to slow down and look a little more closely. And the story here is actually far from over, because just outside the historic station buildings, an entirely new chapter is being written with modern architecture, rising on a former railway land, including the striking new development designed by the London atelier by the late Zaha Hadid, this giant of world architecture. Old and new now stand literally side by side, or they are going to stand side by side because the redevelopment is still going on, and you can see actually some photographs of what it's going to look like. Trains still arrive and depart though, people still pass through, and the city keeps changing, just as it has done here at Masaryčka for nearly 200 years. Of course, the main railway station, or hlavák, which is about half a kilometer or some quarter of a mile away from here, is much larger, is much more dominant. But as far as I'm concerned, Masaryčka has this kind of historic importance and significance still today. And it's alive, as you might actually hear now, because there's a group of children, some on a school trip probably. So, I will sign off. As usual, you can find photographs and more background if you look for Prague off the Beaten Track on the Radio Prague International website. And before I go actually today, just one small update. We've decided that Prague off the Beaten Track will from January 2026 become part of Czechcast, our English language podcast about all things Czech, which you can find, of course, on all the major podcast platforms. That doesn't mean the series is disappearing. Quite the opposite. Prague off the Beaten Track will continue as a regular feature within Czechcast, bringing you these quieter, more reflective stories from the city of Prague. Thanks for listening again. Stay curious about Prague or any other things Czech. And until next time, naslyšenou.
Prague off the beaten track. Vít Pohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.